right? Just because there's a better technology now that is actually more fire safe, it doesn't change the words on the page that were written in 1920 or whatever, right? And so I think we exist to do that. We exist to bring the law up to speed with where technology is.
Welcome to episode 68 of People Are the Answer. I truly believe that people are the only answer to the world's many problems. I'm Jeffrey M. Zucker, a serial entrepreneur, here to learn how innovators are creating outsized, transformational social impact and to shine a light on all the good happening in a world often hyper-focused on the negative. Today's episode features my friend Sal Churi, founder and general partner at Trust Ventures, a VC firm that helps portfolio companies navigate and change regulatory issues that are impeding their progress and their positive impact on society. Sal's father immigrated from Iraq and was the epitome of the American dream, starting from nothing and creating a successful business. When Sal became a law professor, he had the chance to help similar entrepreneurs find their way through entrenched societal policies that were keeping them from their livelihoods, and he realized that was his calling. Sal and I discuss his family's history, which includes surviving the Holocaust and fighting in wars, his growing up in Ohio, and how he transitioned from a law professor to a policy-focused venture capitalist. Definitely one of my favorite episodes so far, and I hope you enjoy. Here is Sal Churi on People Are the Answer. Sal, thanks so much for joining me on People Are the Answer.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. Excited.
Yeah, I've been really looking forward to having you on the show. Excited to share your story with everyone. For the viewers' reference, you and I have known each other. It's been about 5 years now. I was thinking about it before we got on. It's kind of cool.
It's been a while. Yeah. It's funny when you look back.
Yeah, it goes by quickly. And so if you could just start off by telling us who you are, where you're based, and what your current role is.
My name is Sal Churi. I live in Austin, Texas, and I am founder and general partner of Trust Ventures, which is a venture capital fund that invests in early stage startups that have regulatory complexity, and we help solve some of that regulatory complexity alongside the founders.
And in life in general, what would you say motivates you?
Yeah, so I am a very kind of history-driven person. I would say like a lot of what drives me is things that are derived from my family and my family's story. So I think like when you ask that question, it's funny like what neurons fire in my brain. Like I'm thinking about like my dad and my grandma. I kind of was raised in a traditional Jewish household where you talk a lot about generation to generation, door to door, and for us. I just kind of grew up watching my dad. And so I have a bit of a strange entrepreneurial journey in that like I sort of left being a tenure track law professor to go start a venture capital fund. They sound like very, very different things. But I think like when you grow up with an entrepreneur for a parent, the joke is like you grow up as an employee, like whether you want to be or not. And so I think for me, like I think a lot of that like drive, motivation is about kind of what I observed. I think it's like at the most primal atavistic level, it's monkey see, monkey do. But I also think that for me, it's very much just about a drive and a desire to be useful. Like, how can I like maximize what I have to offer the world and to the people that I care about? And so I think those are probably two sides of the same coin. The pessimistic side is just like, I just observed people like working really hard. And so I feel like this motivation to work hard. But I think like at core, like when I wake up, the story I tell myself is that I'm like doing this to make the world a better place. And then I think that's what I feel drives me. I just kind of like look left and look right and see a lot of things that are broken and are eminently fixable, and I want to fix them. And so I think those are maybe the two sides of it.
Yeah, no, I love that perspective. And you and I share some similar history in that regard in terms of growing up in a Jewish family, with entrepreneurial family as well, and just kind of learning along the way, trying to do justice to their efforts. And, normally I ask about where someone grew up, and I'm going to get there, but I think your family history does play a big role in where you are, similar to myself. So maybe you could go back a little bit and share some family history.
Yeah. If I just tell my story, I'm like, I'm from Ohio, I'm from Cincinnati. And like, it's like kind of uninteresting. I think for me though, like the motivating factors are I look at the adversity my family kind of came from. So we're kind of fresh off the boat in two directions. My maternal grandmother was a Holocaust survivor who came to the States. after the Holocaust, and really, kind of lived that New York Jewish immigrant story. My father was born in Baghdad, left as a refugee in the late 40s when the Ba'ath Party came to power. This is kind of a funny story. Very few people know this. When you tell people like, oh, we were like this Jewish family in Iraq, people are like, that's weird. In 1920, the estimated Jewish population of Baghdad was like 30%. It was like the New York City of its time. It's kind of a crazy, like it's just a total trip for people when you tell them that. But so our family had been there. My father's family had been there for over 1,000 years, right? Deep roots in Iraq, and they were basically chased out, dispossessed of everything. He grew up in Israel. He didn't finish high school. He went out and kind of got recruited to go fight in the Six-Day War. He fought in the Yom Kippur War, and then came to the States shortly thereafter. And kind of, he was a tank commander in the Israeli army, the IDF, and so he knew how to fix a tank. So he figured I could probably fix a car too. Started out in a mechanic shop fixing cars. Then he bought the shop. Then he bought another property, and kind of built a business the old-fashioned way in Ohio, in Cincinnati. The reason he came to Cincinnati, which is kind of a fun story, universities have this incredible shaping effect on the trajectory of families through history. And my dad wound up in Cincinnati because the only person he knew in the United States was a cousin of his who had gone straight from Baghdad to the University of Cincinnati on an engineering scholarship many decades before. And so he, of all the places to come in the United States, he was just like, well, I got to go to Cincinnati. So he came to New York, met my mom there, and dragged her kicking and screaming from New York to Cincinnati, which is where I was born. But he built a fairly successful real estate business, just kind of from the ground up, doing all the boring, unsexy things that everyone kind of knows you're supposed to do, but nobody wants to do, right? Like I have that image in my mind of dad getting up and heading off to work, basically before I woke up, coming home when it was time for bed, and he was working all the time, and I saw that. And as I grew, he kind of involved me in the business, right? I was helping him paint and caulk and just kind of doing all the handyman things that go along with owning real estate. And I think watching him build that business, my dad is not an educated guy. He didn't come here with any advantages. I joke that he speaks 3 languages poorly. He speaks a little Arabic, a little Hebrew, a little English. He didn't have a lot of those advantages, and I saw him overcome those things and scrape and claw his way to a really successful kind of entrepreneurial story. And so I think that was with me from the very get-go, as much as he wanted to beat it out of me. But so that was the milieu that I grew up in. Grew up in Cincinnati, and I can talk about my story too. But yeah, just adversity on 2 continents, leading to the United States, and I think also imbued with that just deep love of this country and this deep appreciation for what's possible here, because we had been marched out of our homes at gunpoint on 2 different continents before showing up here. And so I think I've never taken for granted the opportunities ahead of me, in I think a way that some people who grew up here and don't have that kind of recency of a negative experience don't have.
I just relate so deeply to your story. I mean, this is about you, not me. I don't talk about myself a ton on the podcast, but, coming from an immigrant father, immigrated from Israel, who, ground up, built a business. And yeah, I mean, for me, it gives me that sense of like, I want to do justice to the efforts that my grandparents did surviving the Holocaust, that my dad did, as an immigrant, and that my parents built from the ground up. So I really understand that perspective and what it's like to grow up around hard work and just learn the importance of it. So I always appreciate that when we talk.
Yeah. And I think it's also, that's the American dream, right? That's the American story. And that's what we so deeply want to make sure continues to be the case in future generations. I think so many people have like a despondency today that, the generations before us didn't have. And I think we're both optimists. I think that's one reason we're attracted to each other and have kind of forged this friendship. But I do see a lot of people, becoming increasingly cynical about, the opportunities ahead of them. So I think that's one thing that I love about your podcast is like you're always kind of like telling that optimistic human story. And I think that's something that, is important. It's important for people to like hear these stories, important for people to see like, you can build these things. It's not easy. But you have to like hard work and and taking every opportunity and failing 20 times and getting up the 21st time. I believe that still works. And I think, that is very much the American story. So like, to me, that is like the animating factor behind everything I've done in my life.
No, I really appreciate that, trying to make sure the American dream is still alive and well. And obviously we've talked about your family, big part of the story, but what was it like growing up in Cincinnati?
Yeah. I mean, I was in many ways. So I was like, there wasn't a big Iraqi Jewish community in Cincinnati. Actually, and I went to a Christian school growing up. I had an amazing experience in Cincinnati. Like, I loved growing up there. I got to like experience a lot of different cultures just by virtue of having like a family who like I had some ties to kind of New York and and sort of that European Jewish experience, some ties to the Middle East and that like really radically different cultural experience. And then Cincinnati, which is just like, amazing, like American 1980s Stranger Things, like childhood, right? Middle American kind of childhood. And I loved growing up there. I think Cincinnati is just a great kind of blue collar town, like good German American city. And I think a great place to come from, great place to grow up, and kind of grew up there. And, I wasn't sort of like desperate to get out of Cincinnati. I went to Miami of Ohio for college, which was kind of, local. We joked that Miami was a school before Florida was a state. The cool Miami is named after Miami of Ohio, which has been around since 1809. So that's where I went to college. A lot of my very closest friends in the world were my fraternity brothers and friends at Miami of Ohio, and we kind of stayed local. And really only left for law school. Went to Chicago, kind of stayed in the Midwest. And this adventure took me down to Texas, but have kind of popped around the country. I've lived in LA and DC and kind of all over the place. But special place in my heart for Cincinnati.
I can imagine, and I'm sure in our conversations previously it's come up, but anytime I hear Miami, Ohio, I can't help but rub in that BU won the 2009 national championship, which I was at, against Miami, and sorry about that, but not sorry.
We've had some fleeting moments of greatness in sports. Wally Zerbiak, Ben Roethlisberger. I arrived the year after Ben Roethlisberger, so we had a precipitous drop in our AP coach poll. And we're always a hockey powerhouse, but always a bridesmaid, never a bride, sadly.
Well, you mentioned, going to University of Chicago for law school. And I know you spent a couple years as an associate at some firms. And then you became the associate director at the Institute for Justice in the Clinic on Entrepreneurship. So can you tell me about that role and how you got there?
Yeah, so I jumped off the track, right? I think I was, I went to U of C for law school and went to a couple of big law firms, which is kind of like what you're expected to do when you leave one of these law schools. It's really long hours, a lot of reps. You learn a lot quickly, which was what attracted me to it. But I kind of went in knowing I didn't want to die as a law firm partner. That wasn't kind of what I wanted to do forever. I used to joke that there was 2 really great days a month at a law firm, and those were the paydays. And I had a lot of student debt to pay off, so I was motivated by that at the time. But I think what led me to jump off the track was the opportunity to teach. I had always kind of felt like this strong compulsion as to pour back into people because so many people had poured into me, and to kind of pass on knowledge. So I think teaching was always compelling to me, but also the mission of the IJ Clinic was really helping low-income entrepreneurs navigate regulatory complexity. The thesis there is that regulation disproportionately affects lower-income people, right? You see Sam Altman, you see Mark Zuckerberg in front of Congress, and they're just like, we need more regulation. And of course, for those guys, they can just throw their legal department at it. They call Williams and Connolly, they call whoever they need to call, and they're happy to pay $1,500 an hour per lawyer to solve that problem. If you are on the south side of Chicago and you run a small catering business, you don't have that option, right? And so the higher the regulatory hurdle, the more little guys you're really kind of keeping out of the market, because those guys just can't keep up. And that was really the thesis of what we did there. So I spent a couple years working predominantly on the south side of Chicago with lower income entrepreneurs, just kind of trying to build their businesses. And that really spoke to me because that was my dad's story. Like I lived that story. I watched how my father, who built this portfolio of rental properties, the way he would show up as somebody who, didn't have the same education, didn't have the same resources, and he'd show up in City Hall, and there'd be these developers who, they had the credentials, they had the capital, they had the connections, they had the pedigrees, and my dad, would show up and just be this guy wearing a flannel shirt because he was the guy fixing the toilet and they weren't. And that struck me, right? Like I grew up feeling like I want to help that not happen to as many people as I can. And so I look at those. I think in many ways that's still what drives me today, is thinking about all those small business owners who don't have the resources and empowering them against the better resourced. Like that's very much I think in the back of my mind. And what I do is we're on the side of the little guy. We're on the side of the company that just barely exists, fighting against all these big incumbents who, they're just protecting their revenue streams. They don't want to have to compete, right? They don't want to have to, compete for business against these big or these upstart companies who could steal market share from them, right? They don't want to have to do it better. They want to keep it on autopilot because they make money on autopilot, and they fundamentally want to see the world stay the same way. And entrepreneurs fundamentally want to do the opposite. Entrepreneurs fundamentally want to change the world because they only win if something changes. And I saw that in like a very visceral way with my dad growing up, just trying to build something from scraps. Like there was no one there trying to like help him or glad hand him through the process, right? He wasn't someone for whom success was assured. And I saw him show up against these much better resource developers. And one of the reasons I went to law school was I was determined to not let that happen to me, and really to kind of correct what I saw as an injustice, that these incumbents were able to just kind of box out little guys like my dad. And so the IJ Clinic was that role was not just about taking that faculty appointment at the University of Chicago, which was a great motivator to me, but also, Chicago is really my intellectual home, U of C. So that was really exciting to me too. But I think fundamentally why I jumped off the track and why I gave up those big paydays and all the other things that come with being at one of those big, amazing, prestigious firms was really about that opportunity to kind of jump into the arena. Like I saw myself as having built and sharpened this toolkit at Sidley Austin and Kirkland and Ellis, these kind of storied law firms. And instead of just being a $1,500 an hour lawyer to IBM, I wanted to go take that toolkit and apply it to the problems of people who don't normally get access to that. And so that shift was a big shift, right? There were all kinds of resources I had at those firms. I didn't have it at the IJ Clinic, but jumping out and kind of going into the trenches on the South Side and helping everyone from a small tax preparer to a catering business to a tailoring business, and just helping them build and run their businesses. That was just this incredibly inspiring thing. And then ultimately, over the course of the 2 years I was there, really the thing that was defining for me, career defining, was this campaign to help legalize street vending in Chicago. So if you'll permit me, I'd love to tell you this story because it's so inspiring and very much kind of in the DNA of Trust Ventures. It's very much like one of the two kind of things that led me to start Trust Ventures. The story of the street vendor. So in Chicago, there are all these folks who will sell simple foods, tamales, elotes, cut fruit from push carts, just small carts. And these are folks, they're typically immigrants from Mexico, and they're really just grabbing the first rung of the economic ladder. They're trying to feed their families. They're trying to build a business. And they come to America, and this is what they remember from back home. This is what their communities love, right? And if you've had these tamales, they're amazing. So it's arguably the best food in the city. And they would feed folks on their way to work in the morning for $1 a pop, right? As things got more expensive, this was just affordable, delicious comfort food from home. And you looked at the sort of West Town in Chicago, South Side. There are all these restaurants who wanted to get these guys shut down. They didn't want the competition, right? There are these established restaurants, And their side of the story, in fairness, was we have this higher cost base because we've got the brick and mortar and we had to go deal with licensing and permitting and all this stuff. But what I saw was all these people just trying to feed their families by offering people a product they wanted to buy. Like, to me, this is not a crime. And in the America that I believe in, this shouldn't be a crime. And there were people who literally were being shut down, losing their livelihoods, and in some cases sent to jail. There were people who were put in jail for selling people a tamale that they wanted to buy. And mind you, this had nothing. This wasn't about like people getting sick. This was just, the restaurants teaming up with the local alderman, the city council, effectively, to shut down competition. They wanted to protect themselves from competition, because if you can't buy $1 elote, you got to come buy a $4 elote from my shop. And I looked at this and we said, this just isn't good enough. And we fought, and we spent 2 years building coalitions, working with my colleague now at Trust Ventures, who I was trying hard to poach her for many years, Brooke Fallon. She really was the engine behind this, but built a coalition of these street vendors and just helped organize them and really ran this campaign successfully to legalize street vending in Chicago. And I looked at that and I said, what we did here made a massive difference for all those street vendors and all the people that they served. And I said, how do we do this at scale, right? Like I'm sitting there and saying, like, this was great for Westtown. This was great for Little Village. This is great for Chicago. I want to do this. I want to devote my life to doing this, to removing these barriers and impediments that prevent sort of people from building things and building livelihoods and offering people things they want. I want to clear those barriers. I want my life to be about that, but I want to do it at scale. How do I do that at national, international scale, not just here? And at the same time, as I was going through law school, I mentioned some of my friends and fraternity brothers from Miami, Ohio. One of my fraternity brothers had been the first employee at Uber, a guy named Ryan, who college buddy, and kind of watched just from the really embryonic stages, earliest days when he was still the CEO before Travis stepped in. And I'm watching that story happen. And, like everyone else, I was like, oh, you guys are gonna get shut down, blah, 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 blah. And, he's had phenomenal success. And I am very much among those proven wrong by that. And I thought back to, my days at Chicago and talking about kind of like free market economics. And I sort of said to myself, people who fund these campaigns to change laws, right? Like what we had done in Chicago, you fight really hard. And there are people who fight really hard against you. But Uber was this really compelling story where not only did they build an incredible technology, but they cleared away this bad old regulatory regime that had been there for 50 years, right? It had been around forever. And the reason is because laws don't change just because they're outdated, right? When they wrote those laws 50 years ago, they never could have envisioned a technology like Uber, right? And
it'd be great if laws came with a review period. Yeah.
Exactly. And there, people have tried this. There are sunset provisions in some laws, but it's absolutely right? Like laws don't compete in an open market like products do, right? When your iPhone is outdated, and if they don't make a new one, people will switch to Android. Unfortunately, the law doesn't have competition, right? And regulations, bad old regulations, stay on the books forever. And you can read. I mean, there's a whole archive of people complaining about the taxi monopoly for decades. That it was terrible. That the experience in cabs is terrible. Now there's a whole generation of people who don't even remember what cabs are like, which is kind of funny to me. But you and I are old enough to remember what that experience was like. And that is the experience you get when there is no competition. And the law is an arbitrary barrier to competition in that case. And I saw Uber had built this $100 billion business in just a couple of years, really by clearing away that bad old regulatory scheme. And I said to myself, where else does this work? Like, where else can you find something that has the potential to dramatically change people's lives, make transportation cleaner, cheaper, friendlier, more effective, more available? If you were on the South Side and you wanted to get a cab, it wasn't just the cost and the quality of service. You didn't get service, right? People don't remember these days, but I remember how bad it used to be. And Uber really solved so many of those problems, and they built a massive business doing it. And I sort of said to myself, the biggest industries in the world, in the country, are also the most regulated industries, right? regulation grows out of crises. So the things that matter most are where the crises occur. And so it's this whack-a-mole game throughout history of like, you get a crisis and then you try to solve it through regulation. So something bad happened in a taxi one time. And then they said, okay, we're gonna make you get a medallion. We're gonna paint them yellow. You come through the city. And over time, it turns into this monopoly right that is effectively a tradable monopoly. And what you realize is that if you can clear away those bad old regulations, you can like open up massive markets, like $100 billion plus markets, and build some of the biggest economies in the world. Build some of the biggest companies in the world. And that was really, I think, the driving impulse behind Trust Ventures was observing like the impact you can have on real people at the IJ clinic, and then going on to just kind of join the tenure track, kind of teaching faculty at Chicago. And then on the other side, just watching that Uber story, just kind of viscerally, because I knew the people and I kind of watched it happen from really the embryonic stages when it seemed impossible to the incredible triumph. And there's a million other things you could say about it, but I basically said, where else does that work? That I want to do that, right? Like I want to impact people the way I did helping legalize street vending in Chicago, but I want to have that national scale like Uber had. And I said, kind of where else does this work? And so I joined the faculty in Chicago from IJ, and I'm teaching and I'm helping run this program called the Innovation Clinic that I helped launch, where we're working with entrepreneurs, we're working with startups, helping them basically solve these regulatory problems. And realized, very quickly, as you do this, when you solve that regulatory problem for these companies, because they're in such large industries, you end up creating a tremendous amount of value really quickly. And I was a bit slow on the uptake with this, but I realized if you can invest first in the company and then solve the regulatory problem, you're gonna kind of just fundamentally you're buying low and selling high, right? You're kind of benefiting when the company benefits. You're helping to kind of drive alpha, right? You're helping to increase the value of that company by removing those regulatory hurdles. And so what I should be doing is not doing this, for a fee. I should be doing this I should be partnered with these companies. And so that
lets you do it again when they have success.
Exactly. That was the genesis. That was the idea. I mean, it was. I think like many entrepreneurial stories, I stumbled on it. It wasn't I was a brilliant guy with this incredible idea. It was more I sort of kept being I probably should have just invested in that. And then I was like, well, what if I did invest in that? And then built actually a world-class set of capabilities, not just me and my students parachuting in, but really what if I went out and built the toolkit that was purpose-built for this? Because there are law firms with brilliant lawyers and regulatory experts who don't want to work for startups. Lawyers want to work for Monsanto. They want to work for big companies that are going to pay them $1,500 an hour for 50 years, right? That's what they're built to do. Because when Uber goes from a $0 valued company to a $100 billion valued company, the big firms don't get much out of that. They don't have any upside, right? They just get paid by the hour. So they'd rather get paid by the hour by someone who is stable and reliable. And so all the best resources, there isn't really at the time, there was no one out there who really built a set of services that was built for startups with the right risk philosophy, with the right creativity, and with all the right capabilities to go out and help these startups thrive and prosper in regulated industries. And so that was it. That was kind of the kind of eureka moment that set me out on this course to go launch Trust Ventures.
I mean, I love that origin story so much. It's the best way to come up with something, kind of do it for someone and see how to replicate it. And so you spent 5 years at University of Chicago, then, started Trust Ventures, and you mentioned you invest in startups where you can help them fight against the regulatory barriers for their business, correct?
Mm-hmm. That's
it. Yeah. And so, I mean, you kind of just told us sort of the origin of that. And so can you just tell us, what was sort of your next step? How did you get that going? When did you start working with Brian Talkman?
Yeah. So the shift from law professor to venture capitalist sounds like two radically different jobs, but in some ways what I do all day is quite similar to what I did then, right? Which is so much of what we do is about partnering with entrepreneurs and helping them deal with regulatory complexity. So obviously there's many parts of my job that are quite different than they were at the time, but, and I don't get to do the talking head thing except for right now. But I think, that shift was a big shift, and particularly in market at the time, because there was no one else doing this, everyone was like, what are you talking about? I went out, I had this idea, And then I went out and told anyone who would listen, like, hey, I've got this idea. We're going to start a venture fund that's going to invest in heavily regulated companies and help them solve regulatory barriers. And like everyone heard this pitch and was like, why don't you just invest in companies that don't have regulatory problems? And I was like, because that's what everyone else does, number one. So they're over-invested from this perspective. And two, the biggest markets in the world are the most regulated markets. It's energy and healthcare and housing and the things that matter most to people. Like I want to go into those industries. I want to help kind of disrupt the industries where, overpriced housing and overpriced healthcare and lack of access to healthcare and, lack of access to clean energy, these things that are so fundamental to people. I want to go break down the barriers in those industries. And I think, this was like early days. No one got it. Right. And I was kind of like tilting at windmills. It felt like I was tilting at windmills for quite a long time. And then I met the folks at Stand Together and they really were just unbelievable partners. Brian Hooks, Chase Koch, these guys are very much, we would not exist but for these guys. Believing in me and the idea and us, but also really kind of helping bake this, helping take me from this crazy law professor with an idea on a napkin to helping us build a company. And so much credit to those guys for, opening their networks and putting us through the ringer and believing in Trust Ventures and making the bet on it. And so we spent a long time dating. Those guys, really kind of put me through the ringer and in a good way, right? I think challenging me to kind of think about what this will look like as a business, not just getting out on the field and starting to write checks, but really what will this look like on a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year sweep? And I think that was invaluable. In retrospect, like the blueprint we laid out is really the one that we followed. And it was through that process that I met Brian. I had worked with some other kind of potential partners leading up to that. Once I kind of had locked up the anchor investor, I sort of went shopping for a partner. I was like, I need someone who has complementary skill sets, right? I can't do this alone. And Brian was just like this perfect complement to me. He came from, he's much more of an operator, came from operations world, had turned wrenches on helicopters, had been a buyout investor. So I think had a great background as both an investor and an operator. And he really, I think, was a perfect complement. He's an engineer and a physicist. So I think my kind of lawyer, regulatory kind of structuring, analytical brain, his like engineer's mind it's just like a perfect symbiosis for us. And him as kind of more an operational mind, I think has just been like, it's allowed us to build something, I think, with durational value very quickly. And so really I look at all of those folks as kind of partners in that story of us kind of coming into existence. And, once we kind of had that anchor and brought Brian on, and we went out and just raised Fund One. So Fund One was $36 million. And we basically were like, hey, this is a proof of concept. We got to go show the world that one, these kinds of companies exist and they're out there. Some people thought, hey, no one starts companies like that, right? Uber's kind of this one-off, whatever, Airbnb, but there's not a wave of companies like that. So we had to go prove that these companies existed, that we as kind of this unknown quantity could get access to them. We could write them checks that they want to take our money. 3, that we could actually help them change these regulatory conditions to drive value creation. And 4, that we could pick good investments, right? If you do this and the companies die, right? Like let's say you change the law and the company's worthless, then that doesn't help anyone either, right? And so that was really the experience. And really it was through Fund One and just getting out on the field. I think that we kind of proved it out. Fund One was a proof of concept. And today we manage almost $500 million. We've grown pretty quickly from 2018, which was our first fund, to today. But it was really very much, I think we had to get out there and prove it. Like, I think it was like we had to show all those things.
If you're enjoying this episode, I would greatly appreciate if you could review, like, comment, or subscribe on your favorite platforms. Your engaged support goes a long way in helping the show grow and getting our impactful guests heard. Now back to the show. Sounds like there was a lot of proving to do, but I love the basis of the concept. And, I'm curious, you mentioned how they're so often aligned, the business success with clearing the policy paths. Are there ever times where you have to make a trade-off in terms of financial success versus policy success, or are they just always aligned in these instances?
So for us, because of the way that we evaluate and look at companies, the companies we look at, policy success and financial success are very much the same thing, right? So here's what we look for in a company. We want something with a massive market, like over $10 billion, really more like hundreds of billions of dollars. So to us, that's like a metric of impact. Like, how many people does this affect? How big is this problem in society? And that's why you see a lot of our investments are in things like clean energy and housing and healthcare, like things that are just kind of massive industries. That's where we start. And every fund looks for that. But like, I think we do all the same things that other funds do, like product and market and team. But really where we're different is we say, we got to believe that there's some regulatory complexity or barrier that, if solved, can build a massive business, right? So if this is smooth sailing or it's just a compliance problem, we're going to say we're not comparatively advantaged. You don't really need us. We're not the best in the world in it. But if you really have to climb a pretty high mountain from a regulatory perspective in order to get to market, then we're a really good fit, and we're here to help you do that. But I think maybe most importantly is those tend to correlate really well with the biggest markets in the economy. So when you can surmount that barrier, yes, there's additional risk, but when you can surmount it, you can build some of the biggest companies in the economy. And so this is always easier with examples, I think, than just the analytical. So a couple examples from Fund One. One is a company called Icon, 3D printed home builder, right? These guys can build a house out of concrete with a robotic arm. Everyone should just Google Icon build right now. It's amazing. And these guys had this unbelievable idea. They had a 3D printer and it worked, right? The product worked. The question was, like, all of our zoning and permitting and housing, laws are 100 years old. These things were built for sticks and bricks. We've built houses the same way for 1,000+ years, and it is a hard lift to convince your local zoning permitting authorities that you've got some robotic printer that's going to build a house in a day, right? They can put up a house in 24 hours for a fraction of the cost of a traditional stick-built house, which is important, right? Because the housing crisis is a massive problem. People can't afford houses. It's not really getting better, unfortunately. If you look at costs, they're really just going up. And it's really a function of supply, right? We can't make enough new houses, and it's too expensive to build. So if you can dramatically decrease the cost of building and at the same time increase the speed and velocity of building, you have a chance at solving that problem. And their vision is to build 1 million homes, right? They want to get out there and just mass produce high quality, durable, dignified, beautiful houses. And, they built their first house and the permitting authorities showed up, right? And so really the barrier to this company being able to grow and scale and even exist was their ability to surmount this international building code, international fire safety code, these barriers. And so we invested, we helped them get their first permits in the United States for 3D printed homes, and then ultimately to kind of work to get accepted into international building and fire safety codes. I mean, if you think about the fire safety code barrier, just think about it analytically. If you look at international fire safety code, it's about preventing fires, right? And because of the way houses had always been built, they say, you got to put the wooden joist this way. And Icon's like, well, there is no wooden joist. The whole thing's a big fire barrier. Like, it's not flammable. It's like way more fire safe. And they're like, well, we've never heard of anything like that. And so this is like a perfect example of where, like, the law doesn't change just because it should change, right? Just because there's a better technology now that is actually more fire safe, it doesn't change the words on the page that were written in 1920 or whatever, right? And so I think we exist to do that. We exist to bring the law up to speed with where technology is. And it turns out that doing that, in our view, is one of the most important things you can do in the economy, because there are all these technologies out there that already exist that can change people's lives, but that can't get into market because of these outdated regulatory barriers or because of big incumbents who are actively working to keep them out of market to protect themselves from competition, right? And so that is really the role that we serve. And I think Icon's a great example where we wrote them, we wrote them a check. We were the first investors in there. We were in the first round they ever did, and helped them get through those barriers and pave the way for scale. And after that, in the past year or 2 years, they've raised like $400 million, valued at nearly $2 billion. They built a big company, and they're building homes now by hundreds, affordable homes. And I think that is really kind of what we exist to do. Take a technology, an idea, something that works, but where the law hasn't caught up to technology, and then correct for that and open it up to this massive market of people who really need that product or service. So another great example. So that's really one use case for us is,
I mean, what a beautiful example.
Yeah, it's so perfect where it's just an outdated law or regulation built around a world that kind of like we really need to move beyond. But someone's got to come and do the janitorial work. Someone's got to come, mop up and get the law into line with where it needs to be today. So that's one example. And I think another one is that's compelling is really where there are big incumbents who just don't want to compete, right? They're cozy, they're comfortable, they like their position, right? And they don't want to have to compete because they make a lot more money doing things right now with no competition. And I think a great example, there's a company we invested in called Visibly. It's an online eye exam. So if you look at the number of people in the world, there's 2.5 billion people worldwide that need an eye exam and can't get one. It's too expensive. You're not going to solve that problem by just training more optometrists, right? It's not plausible. And even here in the United States, 40% of US counties don't even have an optometrist in them, which means you've got people who, it's not clear that they have good vision and they got to go drive a county or two over just to get their eyes checked every year, which is like not what you want people driving long distances to do, right? And I think we looked at this and we said, man, these guys just have a better solution. And the optometric associations, these lobby groups, state by state, we're just trying to get this shut down, right? And we looked at this and we said, there are all these people who have to take a day off of work, even people who have an optometrist nearby, people have to take a day off of work, who have to take hours off. Like this isn't practical for everybody, and if we could do this in 15 minutes online and cut the price in a third, right? That is going to make a huge difference for a lot of people, right? That is a very big difference for a lot of people. Rather than paying $120, $150, taking a half a day off of work, I can just do this online in 15 minutes. That is a major difference maker for people. And so we said, we're going to jump in and help these guys. And so we invested and we helped them kill bad laws representing 70 million Americans, right? Kill these laws that would have just basically banned them for protectionist reasons. And then I think engaged at the FDA level to get them the first FDA clearance for an online eye exam in history. So I think that's another example where it's just like, it's not just that the law hasn't caught up with technology. It's like there are forces in the economy that are actively trying to prevent change. They're trying to prevent the world from getting better for all those consumers and all those people who don't want to spend $150 and a half a day getting their eyes checked every year. That is just, it seems like a small thing perhaps, but I think to a lot of people, it's a lot. And
small things add up.
Exactly.
A lot of people, right? So.
And the more of those that we can clear out, the more we can lower costs for people, increase access for people. Because I think for a lot of people, the answer is they just don't do it, right? There are all these people walking around who either can't see well or can't see at all because they can't afford the time off, they can't afford the cost. And for us, that's just immoral. Like I think for us, we exist in the world because there are people walking around who can't see because there's a monopolist who wants to protect themselves from competition. That's just not good enough. So for us, we exist to open those barriers, to increase access to quality, affordable healthcare, increase access to housing. Those are the things we exist to do.
So I often repeat a line I've heard that business is the most powerful vehicle for change. And so, when people hear like, oh, there's a venture capital fund that is trying to change laws to help the companies they're investing in, like there's such a way that society and media could interpret that to be like, oh, they're just trying to help themselves. But in reality, like the fact that you're invested is giving you the tools to continue to do this. And I just think it's so important for the world to recognize how business can truly be so impactful and change.
Yeah. I don't think we could do this at a nonprofit. I think what is fundamental to what we do, and look, we're a returns focused venture capital fund. I exist to, my LPs give me $1 and I'm here to give them back $5, right? Of course, past performance is not indicative of future results, but we have very much succeeded in our mature funds in generating, really good returns. And I think, we exist to generate returns for our LPs. We have a profit motive, right? But I think at core, the way we generate those profits and really to me, why we do this is that passion for changing those things. that have remained stuck for decades and decades.
You've built a business where the path to profit is a good path that's clearing the way for a better world.
Exactly. This is good profit, right? That's our view, is like, we can't succeed, we can't generate profit without removing these regulatory barriers. And I kind of look at it and I say these monopolies are like piggy banks, right? If you break them open, there's a lot of value hiding inside. And these monopolies have persisted for decades, centuries, by not having to compete, which means fundamentally people are getting worse products, worse services, paying more for things than they need to pay. And if you can correct that, you make a bunch of money, right? Like, and it's good for people. And so to me, it's a virtuous cycle, right? Those two things are in perfect harmony. If you look at the cab story, there were nonprofits working on this. There were candidates who campaigned on this. There were white papers written in the 1980s about deregulating the cabs, and kind of nothing happened. Some of them deregulated, but that deregulation was washed through the political process. So, in the actual structuring of those new permitting schemes, they built in things that were just as bad as what they came from, and many of them went back to the original regime. It takes an entrepreneur building a better future, in my view, in order to pull you out of that old paradigm, because people on a marble dais in Washington or your local city council, they are not the people to find the wisdom for all of us. I believe it's entrepreneurs who kind of build that better future and hand it to people, and consumers who vote with their feet and say, I want to take an Uber, right? Just think. So take yourself back to the day before Uber, right? And imagine you're a city council member and this entrepreneur comes to you and says, I've got this great idea. We're going to have strangers riding around in each other's cars and they're going to get from point A to point B, right? You would be terrified. Uber is one of these things that sounds terrifying in the abstract, but when you've experienced it, you're like, oh, this is obvious. But there's all these things that, sound obvious after you've done them, but sound really non-obvious until you try them. And I think it's important that we keep the doors open for that experimentation. And so, yeah, I think that is kind of what we exist to do, is find those for-profit companies, right? Company solutions who are incentivized to build great products that improve people's lives, and where they are measured in their ability to improve people's lives by people buying those products and services. But really kind of helping them deal with those old regulatory barriers that keep them out of market.
Is there a particular stage in a company where you like to invest, or is it just sort of based on the policy and financial opportunity? If whether I brought you an idea or whether, we're in Series C? Yeah,
we've invested in everything from pre-seed, idea on a napkin stage companies, first money in, to things that are pretty large Series Bs, companies generating $100+ million in revenue, real companies. Now, usually when we're doing those more mature ones, we had already been invested back when they were small companies. And so I think we tend to want to continue to support those companies when we've built relationships and built kind of a playbook. And they continue to want us on the cap table. They continue to value our partnership and support from a regulatory perspective as they grow. I think what we see value to add all along the growth trajectory of a company, usually when they get big enough, right? When you're big enough to show up in front of Congress, you either don't need us or you don't want us, right? Because as soon as Mark Zuckerberg's big enough to get called in front of Congress, all of a sudden his incentives change. He no longer wants to pull down the walls, right? And this is not about, Mark Zuckerberg in particular. It's just when you're an incumbent, all of a sudden you have incentives to keep the world the same way, because now you can afford to pay the toll tax for whatever, you can afford to pay the toll tax for kind of whatever the regulatory cost of doing business is. You can pay the speeding ticket. That's how you look at it. But I, in the back of my mind, always have those street vendors in my mind. The people where the toll matters, right? It's not everybody. It's not everyone can throw a compliance department at some problem. And I think, look, this isn't a story about how the people writing these regulations are evil. I think most of them are well-meaning. They just can't see everything in the economy. They don't see everyone that what they write affects. And I've seen so many of these people who've been negatively affected by it. And to me, I think I have a deep passion for trying to level that playing field and open the door to these small competitors, because I've seen all the lives that are enriched by people starting businesses. And that's fundamental to what we do. I don't think you could do this at a nonprofit. I think it's just a fundamentally different enterprise.
Absolutely. And, I specifically wanted to ask about your efforts in clean energy. And then another question I had that perhaps could be folded in is, practically, how are you affecting policy change?
Yeah. So clean energy is one near and dear to our hearts. It's huge, right? Energy is like the biggest market in the world, right? If you look at a chart of human quality of life, it tracks pretty closely with the amount of energy output we have. And, I think our philosophy is we want abundant energy, right? Our energy philosophy is abundance first. We need a lot more energy than we have right now. And our view is we love renewables. We love wind. We love solar. The problem with wind and solar is they are great when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, and kind of useless when they're not. And so we look at industrials. Industrials are like a third of emissions, right? A third of our energy need. And in particular in places like India and China, unless you make it cheaper, they're not going to use it, right? And someone can show you a cost curve on solar and say, oh, it's the cheapest form of energy. And it's like, yes, at noon in Arizona, it's really cheap. But almost every factory I know wants 100% uptime. They run those things 24 hours a day. And if they're offline for 3 hours, that costs them hundreds of millions of dollars, potentially. So it's really just not an option to have intermittent energy. And that's why they're on hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are incredibly reliable and they're cheap. They're good at doing what they do. If you can find a solution that is cheaper and not intermittent, that to us is the holy grail, because that not only creates this opportunity to deploy clean energy in all these use cases in places like India and China, where they're not going to do it just because it's good for the environment. It's got to be cheaper, right? And their argument is the West burned biomass to get where they are, and we're not going to throttle ourselves. You didn't, and I understand that argument. And I think, to me, like, my conviction here is you've got to find a cheaper way to do it cleaner, right? I think that is the trust measures philosophy. Energy abundance. And so I think as a result, where we focused is affordable batteries that can help load balance a factory, and nuclear power. And we've looked at other things like geothermal and hydrogen. And I think we don't like to invest in, we like frontier technologies that are more engineering problems rather than science projects, right? Things that are in labs are a bad fit for us. We like things where the technology exists, it's proven, and we know it works. But the regulatory piece is complex. And so, two examples. We are early investors in a company called Oklo. It's a modular nuclear reactor company. They build a reactor that can power a data center off grid, with one sort of reactor, and they could power a small city. And we kind of look at this and say microgrids are a really interesting use case. Nuclear is baseload. It is the most energy dense material on the planet. Right? You can power your life need for energy with a golf ball size of plutonium or uranium. And I think, nuclear has this complex history. And in large part, I think it's a story of like the greatest technology arguably ever discovered, right? The splitting of the atom is
but it's
maybe
stigmatized.
It's exactly right. It is maybe one of the most foundational discoveries in human history. I think akin to discovering fire. But we had this moment in America where we said we're heading to the next atomic age. And then you got 3 Mile Island, and you got Fukushima, then you got Chernobyl, and then later Fukushima. And certainly safety is important, but I think what we need to, I think what we view as compelling in this is we have had since the 60s technology that is dramatically safer, right? So if you look up EBR2, Experimental Breeder Reactor 2, Argonne Labs ran this reactor from the 60s to the 80s, 30 years. They intentionally tried to melt the thing down. They tried to demonstrate its safety by intentionally trying to overheat it. And it is a passively safe, passively cooled design, meaning when it overheats, it just shuts down, right? That reactor ran for 30 years, put out 3 cents, zero emission electricity, right? This is energy that is cheaper and cleaner than solar from a life cycle energy perspective. Cheaper than natural gas, cleaner than solar, right? It sounds too good to be true. And it's been on a shelf for many years. What Oklo's done is taken that technology and adapted it to modern use cases and sort of turned what used to be this 30-year site-built reactor design into a widget, something that can be manufactured in a factory at high precision and then deployed in our existing logistics framework. So I think very excited to announce that earlier this week, actually, Oklo just announced a SPAC. They're going public. Sam Altman has a great kind of video explaining all this, and he's the chairman of the board and has been kind of a supporter for a long time. But I think we look at this and say this has the potential to leapfrog the grid. You look at places like sub-Saharan Africa where large percentage, the majority of it, is off-grid. And then you look at something like the cell phone, right? They never bothered putting landlines in down there. They just leapfrogged it and went straight to the cell phone. Could we imagine a world in which clean, cheap power did the same thing, dramatically enriching people's lives around the globe, right? Because if it's the cheapest answer, it's gonna get used everywhere, right? And if it's the safest answer, it can get used everywhere. And so from our perspective, if they can build something that is 100% safe and dramatically cheaper and cleaner than anything else in market, that will be the answer worldwide. And so that's a good example of what we worked on. As you might imagine, there's a ton of regulatory complexity there. And for good reasons. I don't think we think it should be completely the wild, wild west. It's hard to buy nuclear material. That's probably a good thing in some ways. But I think we look at it and we say, there's two companies who brought a nuclear reactor to market in America, like ever, GE and Westinghouse. And their mentality has been, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And we have these old reactors and they're broke. They need to be fixed, right? I think it's the reactors we have, we absolutely need to keep online, right? Because it's incredible baseload, cheap, clean energy. But the key is we've got to move forward and we've got to innovate, right? I think Oklo represents this opportunity to innovate and produce all this cheap, clean energy and do it in a scalable way. And I think we have to move forward. And so as I look at that, like so much of what we've done there from a regulatory perspective has been educating the right folks, lawmakers, and about what they're doing, right? Often it's not even controversial. It's just that, you look at, there's a provision in a law a couple of years ago, a proposed law that was going to just basically say, hey, we want all these advanced reactors to have access to the fuel that they need. And it's hard to get access to nuclear fuel. But, to make sure we're not wasting it, we want to subject it to a panel of industry experts, right? Which, in this case, the industry is two companies. And if you ask them, hey, is this new competitor to you a good idea? You can imagine they are incentivized to say no, right? They have a dog in the fight. And so I think helping to get that stripped out was one example. But I think there's so many things that people think of as regulatory is controversial. A lot of it is just bringing that to the attention of lawmakers who hadn't really thought about it, don't know the history of it, because they can't know everything, right? They necessarily have to deal with so many different questions. And I think solving some of those little problems and really helping to introduce that connectivity can produce tremendous outcomes for society. And we look at the opportunities ahead for a company like Oklo and we say, this has a staggering potential impact for humanity. One other example is a company called Antora Energy. It's a carbon-based battery. They can heat basically pencil lead. Think of just a carbon block up over 1,000 degrees. And it just stays really hot. And they can use that to power industrials, power factories, power process heat, which it turns out, if you want to smelt steel or iron, if you want to produce cement, concrete, you need a lot of heat. And the way we do it today is you use hydrocarbons to produce electricity, right? So you're collecting the energy and kind of converting it to electricity. And then you take that electricity and you convert it into heat, right? And there's loss in both of those conversions. Antora says, hey, we're going to use cheap renewables to capture energy at noon when the sun is shining, right? Cheap solar. And we're going to use it to heat this carbon block up. And we're going to keep that in a vacuum sealed high heat container. And then we're going to discharge that heat directly. So dramatically more efficiently, dramatically cheaper than anything that exists in the market today. And we're going to use that to heat your factory. We're going to use that to kind of do all these high heat industrial processes. It's another one that I think just has tremendous potential to kind of, impact the cost of energy, impact the abundance of energy, and impact, how clean the energy that our industrials are using is. And I think for us, those are kind of win-wins all around.
And I hope for those listening, they're as excited as I am, and just hearing it's so great that these things are out there and that they're coming, and there's such tremendous potential impact. And so it's just an example of the world is so focused on the negative, and here I'm trying to highlight positive, and this is the kind of stuff exactly that, I want the world to know about. Like, there's good people working on great solutions to many of our problems.
And Jeff, you nailed it. That is we only really work on things that like most people agree on. Like we're not like looking for things that are controversial, right? I think we're looking for things where it's like everyone generally stands to benefit from this, but it's really hard because there's a small interest group, who really benefits from the way things are, right? We look for things where like 7 billion people win and, a couple thousand people, stand to not benefit from it. And I think that's really kind of the equation we look for, is like, it's places where it's time for the world to change. And it just kind of hasn't, either because of inertia of the law or because there's an incumbent who's like out there trying to keep the world the way it is.
Yeah, I mean, even those thousands that may, have financial incentives for it not to work out, in the long run, it's good for them too. They're citizens of Earth, so
citizens of Earth, and it's also just like it's the Luddite problem, right? Everyone should check out Pessimist's archives. Like, there's all these examples where we thought the advent of new technologies was gonna harm society. There's all these hilarious. They have these great examples like the felt hat makers, people who made felt hats when bicycles came into fashion. They very nearly passed a federal law in the United States requiring the purchase of 2 felt hats a year because they were worried that people biking around wouldn't want to wear these heavy hats anymore because they'd be sweating. Like, ultimately, the world was better with bicycles. The world was better when we all moved from farms to factories to information technologies. And I'm a believer in the bounty of technology and its ability to improve our lives. And I think fundamentally, it's a better thing for people to kind of move towards doing things that add more real value in people's lives rather than kind of protecting turf and holding the world back from progress.
Yeah, this conversation makes me think of something that's very popular to talk about these days, AI. And I was just wondering, is that an area you guys consider controversial? Have you delved into it? There's obviously a lot of doom and gloom scenarios that have been put out there.
Yeah. I think this is certainly a debatable point. AI is in the middle of like a hype cycle right now, for sure. But we're believers in the power of the technology, right? I think it's pretty clear that this is going to change the world. You can see the very dramatic impacts that it can have. And I think we're really excited about those impacts. We look at, what does it mean that now all these people who can't get access to justice, can't access our legal system in a meaningful way, which, by the way, is a lot of people, right? Like you got to be a millionaire to afford a lawyer in this country in a real way for many applications. Access to healthcare. What does it mean to make a doctor's life a lot more efficient, right? By some estimates, doctors spend a third of their day just writing things in charts. That's not why any of them went to medical school. They all hate doing that. And they'd all like to spend more time with their patients and see more patients, right? Help more people. That's why people go to medical school. And so, I think we look at the potential for AI. We're seeing these companies on the horizon and saying, this might be the greatest GDP driver, quality of life driver since the internet. But there's a very real risk that this is strangled in the cradle, right? Look at the policy responses that you've heard so far in the popular consciousness. It's either turn it off, right? There's this big push to just like ban AI or like impose a moratorium, which, there's very real risk that we should take seriously. I don't think, I'm not one of these, let's just wave it off. I think we should take the risk seriously. But I also don't think turning it off is plausible or advisable. So turn it off, make another FDA for it, which, I think the FDA does its best, but its risk tolerance is such that a lot of people suffer for not getting access to things because of an overly burdensome process. It takes $1 billion to bring a new drug to market. That means a lot of new drugs for things that aren't core diseases that hit massive hundreds of millions of people just don't get done. It's just not economical, right? And I think that risk philosophy applied to something like AI could be really destructive. You don't see the innovation that doesn't happen, right? That's the hard part, and I think that's a fear I have with that. Like, let's just make another FDA, right? And then there's let's just hand the keys to the incumbents, right? I think you hear this perspective too. Like, let's just let the big tech players who've already got big LLMs and hundreds of millions plus of funding, billions of funding and all the compute, let's just hand them the keys. And I don't think that's the answer either, right? I think we need to we need to create a level playing field, and we should be thinking about the risks. But I think, from my perspective, this could be the greatest driver of improving people's lives, increasing GDP that we've seen since the internet. And it's incumbent on us to find ways to manage risk, but also not strangle this opportunity before it really has a chance to get into people's hands and really improve their lives.
Well, yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'm curious to see, where that goes, how it evolves. And, there's a lot of your portfolio companies I find fascinating, and we don't have the time to cover all of them or all of your different areas that you guys hit, but I strongly encourage those listening to kind of check out your website, check out the portfolio, some really awesome things that you guys are working on. And I'm curious, Trust, you started it in 2018. It's been 5 years. What do you envision for the future of this company?
If you asked me what I would do if I had billions of dollars, I would just do this. I love what I do. I think I'm one of the very few people that found like the center of the Venn diagram of like where I should be in the world. I'm incredibly self-actualized doing what I'm doing. And so
I love that.
We just envision. Thank you. We just envision, my partner and I, we've got big dreams for the future. I think Brian and I look at this and we say, we can help more entrepreneurs. We can help them more. We can build ever better capabilities that can take on ever more entrenched competition and solve ever bigger problems. And my hope is that we can play some role in more and more entrepreneurs wanting to take on these kind of dirt under the fingernail problems, right? And things like labor and healthcare and energy and housing and just these core societal needs, right? Our hope is that through the success that we can kind of help our portfolio of companies achieve, more companies, more founders will be inspired and incentivized to go start similar companies, and that we'll get to be a small part of those stories as well. So I think that's our hope. I think we want to just do more of this. I love what I do every day, and I just want to do more of it.
Awesome. Yeah, I love what you do as well. I think it's so impactful for the world. And yes, I would love to, down the road, let's do this again. Let's talk about trust again. I have more questions, but just sort of wrapping the trust specific stuff. I didn't want to neglect mentioning that you're a board member at Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Maybe if you could just briefly tell the listeners what Mercatus is, and if they've heard some of my other episodes with guys like Brian Hooks, they've probably heard a little bit about it, but would love to just briefly hear what it is and how you got involved.
So as I mentioned, Chase Koch and Brian Hooks were really kind of, I think, godfathers, mentors to me in starting this business and helping take me from like a wacky professor with a bunch of ideas on my chalkboard to like a person who's actually running a real company. And just getting to know them through that experience and seeing what they were working on, I just really became passionate about the work Mercatus was doing. Right? It's very much approaching the same problems from a different lens. They are the scholarly lens. They're sort of where the world of ideas meets the practical world, and sort of translating a lot of what's coming out of the academy at the very bleeding edge into actionable insights for policymakers and lawmakers to kind of consider. And so I think Mercatus is a think tank, but they are the ones that really kind of live between the world of ideas and the world of action. And so I think they are working on all these areas, housing, healthcare, and all these things that I care so deeply about. And they're just attacking those problems from a different angle. And so, I'm also just a huge fan of Tyler Cowen's. I don't know if you've had him on here. You should have it.
I have not yet.
So, to me, a big part of what got me passionate about Mercatus and their work was just Tyler. I think Tyler, Marginal Revolution, all his books. He's just one of the most voracious readers and thinkers and idiosyncratic thinkers of our time. And I think he's a great mind. And one of the things my dad taught me young is just sort of like, go find the smartest people you can and just kind of like hang out with them. Right. And so for me, the opportunity to hang out with Tyler and the incredible stable of scholars that Mercatus has built has just been like this really incredible experience. So for me, I love to learn at the feet of smart people, and they've been just such an inspiration to the work that we do at Trust, and really just trying to improve people's lives through improving policy that has either outlived its usefulness or serves to kind of protecting some incumbents from competition. So I think they are very much, I think, of a mind with us, just approaching the problem from a different angle.
Yeah, and I like how you put it in terms of being in between sort of the learning and the action, and that can really go a long way in helping others make positive change. So thank you for your work there. And now I have, a few sort of more zoomed out questions, if you will. Can you tell me a story of when you really saw, how directly your work could affect change, really on like a personal level for someone?
Yeah. I mean, I think every investment that we make, we think about the individual. Who is the individual on the other side of this product or service that desperately needs it? And so, the example of Icon, that 3D printed home builder, we got to meet the first person to move into a 3D printed house in the United States. And he was a formerly unhoused person, right? I think taking a person who was previously homeless and putting them in a home, it's an inspiring thing because, from our perspective, there's a lot of people out there who can't get housing because it's too expensive. And that is a very visceral output to me. And so often the fruits of technology flow first to the top of the socioeconomic pyramid. And it's incredible when you can build something that is for everyone and actually see that get into someone's hands. I've seen the people who had to take a half day off of work, the single mom who had to trudge through the snow in South Chicago to get her eye exam because that was the only way to do it. And for whom that $120 made a big difference, and for whom having to find childcare, and for whom taking a day off of work was a big problem. I've seen that person, and I've seen what something like Visibly can do for that person. And then I think there's also the more grand scale things where it's like I look at things like Antora Energy and Oklo Energy, just cheaper, cleaner forms of energy that are abundant baseload sources of energy, and I say these can affect billions of people's lives, like truly the whole world. When you look back at that chart that plots the correlation between energy usage and quality of life, and so many people out there now are saying we just need to reduce our use of energy, and it's like you can do that all day. You can use cloth bags and drive a Tesla, and that's great. More power to you. But we're not going to change anything by doing that if India and China, who are growing and industrializing really quickly, aren't curtailing their use of fossil fuels, right? And I think fundamentally, philosophically, I don't want to make people's lives worse by telling them to consume less. I want to enable them to approach life from an abundance and not a scarcity mentality. And so I think about that both from the macro perspective. I think energy is a good example, and then the micro perspective. I've seen a homeless person move into a 3D printed house. I've seen the person who couldn't afford to take a day off of work to get their eyes checked in 15 minutes at home for a third of the price. I've seen those real human impacts, and that's really why we get out of bed in the morning.
Well, I love that perspective on the energy situation and noting that track with the abundance of energy and how we just need to determine ways to utilize it better, more efficiently versus cutting. And then, when you hear about those little changes, like the person with their eye exam and someone getting a home, I mean, you're also opening up all this potential in these people who have had to focus on survival for so much of their lives and haven't been able to focus on what it is they're good at and what they bring to the world. And you're kind of opening up many people to that.
Yeah, it is. I think a big part of why we do what we do is the people that get to benefit from these products and services. We get to see the impacts, and it's just really compelling and really inspiring.
So we've talked some about your dad, about Brian Hooks, Chase Koch. Anyone else in particular that's been a really impactful sort of mentor to you?
I have so many mentors, both from my time in the academy, from my time in legal practice, and my time growing up. Friends, parents. I owe so much of what I have to the people who poured into me. But I do want to take a minute and talk about partnership. Because I suspect a lot of people who listen to this podcast are people who are aspiring entrepreneurs. I think you probably attract that crowd, just given what I know about you and who you talk to. And I think in so many ways, the most important thing you do when you start a business is not the idea or even the work. Sometimes it's not even the problem you solve. It's your partners. And to me, I have achieved so much in partnership with Brian that it's like, I think it's just worth spending a minute on it. I think who you pick is so important to the journey you go on. For us, that entrepreneurial journey is a lifelong journey. We are still really close friends. We go on vacations with our families every year. We are, I think, uniquely benefited by our partnership, not just in terms of building the business, but finding complementary capabilities and shared values, right? And compatible visions and sort of shared visions and values. That is the most important thing in so many ways to starting a business. And so I think I am just so lucky that I found like an incredible partner where we both kind of shore up one another's weaknesses and enhance one another's strengths. That I think like that's something I call out. Like I think could not have built this business without Brian, without our team. We have assembled a team of we joke that it's a team of assassins. They're just, I think, people who are the very best at what they do, and people who are not only incredible people, but make massive impacts every single day. So I think I'm just very lucky to work in partnership with people like my team, like Brian, and like our investors who've invested in us and believed in us and supported us in so many substantial ways. And even just growing up, I think my dad's the biggest influence, from an entrepreneurial perspective. I think so much of what I took from him, I apply every day, right? That sort of work ethic, that focus on your customer, that servant mentality. I think you have to have that service orientation to do anything well, in my opinion. Like entrepreneurship is fundamentally about empathy for your customer. And for us, we have many customers, right? As a fund, entrepreneurs are one of them. And I think entrepreneurs embark on what is, I think, a really trying and challenging journey. It is something that I think is not well understood by people who've not done it. And so it's also really inspiring to get to work with these people because you have to be an eternal optimist to really start a company. You know this. You've got to be willing to get punched in the face every day. And it really is that get up, get knocked down 20 times, get up 21. It really is that sort of a journey. So yeah.
And the people around you are,
around
you will help you. It's important that you have those good people that are going to help pick you up and not just complain that you're on the ground, so.
But those are the people who move history forward, right? I liken it to that kind of like man against nature. It's someone who's willing to dare impossible things. And we say that today like it's a cliche, but to me, it's very real. It's very visceral. I looked at my dad, who was just a little guy with rattling his saber against very big, against long odds. And I see what he was capable of building, and that inspires me because he had so many fewer advantages, so many fewer allies than I have and that so many people have. And he was able to overcome all that. And so, I'm attracted to entrepreneurs. I'm inspired by entrepreneurs. All of our founders in our portfolio are like such a big part of why I love doing what we're doing. Like it is so inspiring to see them every day building these things that can really change people's lives. So I'm like so privileged to work with an incredible slate of founders.
I wish our dads could have met before mine passed. It sounds like they certainly shared a lot of similarities in terms of mindset and work ethic. So yeah, I certainly appreciate that. So now, if you'd like, you can ask me a question.
Okay. Zucker, who is the most interesting person that you've talked to on this podcast and why?
There's certain people that I already have a connection with, like you, that I really enjoy talking to, and I already know a lot about your work, and that is like very enriching to me. But then there's people who I'm kind of learning about as we're talking, and it's so different. If I really had to pick the most interesting off the top of my head, I'd probably say someone that we both know, Shin Choi, Stand Together Ventures Lab.
What is what you perceive as the biggest problem facing humanity today? And the biggest potential solution you see for most compelling
I think our biggest problem is divisiveness, lack of compassion. And the biggest tools to that are different ways of creating empathy. Things that I work on that I think are ways of creating empathy are psychedelic therapy. I think incorporating important messages into film content, which is one of the ways that we capture people's attentions these days, is another way to start shifting minds in the right direction. I think the biggest tool in ending some of this divisiveness and creating empathy is just humanizing each other and understanding that, we're all part of this journey on Earth together. And I think there's a variety of ways to do that, but we just need an abundance of that.
I love it.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. And Just a couple more for you. If it were all to end tomorrow, whatever that means to you, what are you either most grateful for or most proud of?
I'm going to give a cliche answer. I am so proud of my children and my wife. We have two young children, and every day that I see them take another kind of leap forward, it is so just visceral and powerful and affecting in a way that nothing else is. And we're so fortunate to be able to sort of experience it alongside them. So, I guess that's probably like cliched answer, but it's the truth.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's beautiful. I am in a similar boat with two young kids, and it's remarkable to see what they do every day, how they grow every day so fast, and how they're learning and perceiving the world. And sometimes I think not enough of us try to see the world through their eyes. And I wonder, they probably have a better perspective. We're all sort of jaded through life and the mess that is society. So I certainly try to see things through their eyes a little bit.
And I very much believe in, like, to take this back to the very beginning, like I take that intergenerational perspective on it, right? Like seeing my son, Rami, who's named after my father, seeing them interact is just like such a powerful thing to me, right? Like so often we get stuck in our own perspective on things, as I think you're alluding to there. Seeing it through my son's eyes, seeing it through my father's eyes, right? And where our family kind of, where our chain has gotten in a generation and a half is staggering. Like my father goes from being marched out of his home at gunpoint in Baghdad to a successful business owner in the United States, and watching all the opportunities that I see my son growing and that are on his horizon. It's amazing. It's so affecting, and I also think of myself as having an obligation to really pass down a lot of those lessons from my father and his family and my mother's family, right? So many of the lessons that they took away from those hard experiences, because we're privileged to live. I think, to go back to Tyler Cowen, he says we've been privileged to live outside of history for a little while here in America. We haven't had to deal with things like what my father and my grandmother dealt with in the Holocaust or the Farhoods. Like we're privileged to live in a time when we live in relative safety and in relative comfort and in relative prosperity, and not relative prosperity, absolute prosperity, right? The King of England had really bad healthcare compared to anyone in the United States today, right? And so I think we have to be thankful for all those things. But I also see an obligation to remember the way that those things were and to pass those lessons on to the next generation, because it was more real to me because my father lived through it, my grandmother lived through it. I saw the way that affected them, and I think things may not always be so good, and so I think it's important to kind of pass down those lessons and remaining humble and remaining kind of thoughtful about your place in the world. I think those are things that I hope to pass down from my father to my son, even though I didn't live them in the same visceral way as my father. My hope is that I can kind of be a vessel for helping to convey some of those values through another generation.
It's a beautiful perspective. Thank you for sharing. And sort of the big question that I ask every guest toward the end of the episode is this: if you could snap your fingers and fix one thing in the world, what would it be? And how do you think that change would reverberate?
Man, I spend my whole day thinking about this. It's kind of like the question I asked you, who's the most interesting conversation. It's hard to pick a favorite, right? Because it's on my mind right now, I'm going to say energy. I'm going to say bringing back clean, affordable, safe nuclear power, and really opening the door for that. And I think that's something we've been spending a lot of time on with Oklo, watching them out there in the world, building a solution to our energy crisis, building an energy abundance solution as well as a clean energy solution. I think, more cheap, clean, affordable energy around the world, allowing all these places to leapfrog the grid and really kind of build abundance and improving quality of life. It's a hard one to beat. So I'm going to go with that.
Yeah. No, that's so true, especially when you kept mentioning sort of that, how it tracks with human progress and how life quality of life for people. And so that would certainly go a very long way. And I hope that we are on that path thanks to places like Trust Ventures and companies like Oklo. So, I've certainly really enjoyed this talk. It's definitely one of my favorites that I've had. And I'm sure people listening are inspired. How can people support you and your impact?
Send us companies, right? Anyone who is starting a company that is working on a fundamental core societal need, something that affects hundreds of millions or even billions of people, but where an outdated law or an incumbent-driven law or just regulatory complexity make it really hard for you to innovate, please call us, trustventures.com. Come find me. We are looking for entrepreneurs who are solving these society scale problems. So I think that is, if you want to help, and we've got a newsletter. So if you want to learn more on what we're up to, we're happy to kind of share more of that. And you can kind of keep tabs on what we're up to. But I think that's what we're passionate about is finding those entrepreneurs who are kind of the next crop of Oklos and icons and Visiblies who are gonna really dramatically impact people's lives and where we can kind of play a small role in supporting those founders on their journeys.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'll certainly keep an eye out for those individuals and hope others will as well. And I just love what you guys do. I love what you stand for. And really, the work that you guys are doing is one of the reasons that I started this podcast, and to show people that there are people doing good things to try to figure out our problems, and doing it in thoughtful, caring ways. And not all business is cruel, like some people think. So I just love the example that you guys are setting and the work that you're doing. And, really thank you for your time. Look forward to continuing our own conversation and sharing this story with the world.
I want to just say one more thing before we conclude on the business's point. I think it's important to think about the different types of business. I spend a lot of time working with small businesses that are really community businesses. It is a baker making muffins for people in her neighborhood. Someone cooking tamales and elotes for people who are going to come by on their way to work. That is someone who's pouring their heart into something that is going to affect their customers throughout their day. They're just trying to earn an honest living. And I think it's tempting to just, when you think of business, you think of, just like giant Fortune 20 companies. You think of, Chevron. And look, still those companies are selling people something that they want to buy. And I think you have to take account of the fact that at core, there is empathy in that. They care what their consumer wants and they listen to their consumers, or they suffer. They suffer the peril of their consumers if they don't. But I do think business is really I think you have to look at it at the atomic level too and say, fundamentally, it's about giving people something that they want, finding a way to use your skills and talents to produce something that someone needs and can't get themselves. It's a way to, free exchange is a way to enrich everybody's life and create mutual benefit. And I think you have to look at that big picture. I know it's tempting to just kind of be like, I'm mad at tech support for Apple right now or whatever it is, right? But I do think that you have to look at the atomic level and think about the role that business plays in society. And in my view, it's for the betterment of society. Especially business if you're doing it the right way, right? From my perspective, there's a right way and a wrong way. Those incumbents who are trying to prevent change, prevent progress, that's the wrong way. So that's the way I look at it.
Agreed. Beautiful way to end this. Thanks so much for your time, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Talk soon, man.
Thanks for listening to this episode of People Are the Answer. If you enjoyed the episode, share it with friends, and reviews or subscriptions on your favorite platforms go a long way to help the show grow. I want to share these incredible people and their remarkable work with as many others as possible. Thanks for your support. For more, go to peoplearetheanswer.com.